Okay, well, the last 10 years or so really has seen quite an explosion in interest, but also concern about what we eat. You think of the interest, celebrity chefs, the Great British Bake Off, all that. But also a lot of concern and anxiety about the actual food we're putting in our mouths, where it comes from, what's in it, and the impact it has on our health and our environment. And above all else, the thing is when it comes to food, it's seen all about your choice, isn't it? And if you're not making the right ones, then it's your fault. Because I think food can become a very emotive subject. It's intrinsically personal. It feels like you're choosing to put food in your mouth. So the debates actually become quite laden with moralism. The right wing is very moralistic, isn't it? At its most crude, you hear arguments that somehow problems in society are due to families not sitting down together and having meals together. But actually, you do get some of this moralism on the left as well. You think about some of the recent climate demonstrations, some of the placards would read things like, want to change the climate, change your diet, go vegan, or there's no such thing as a meat-eating environmentalist. And I would say the conclusion for both those on the right and some on the left is that the solutions to the problems we face are individual. If we all went vegan, we'd stop climate change. If we didn't overconsume or waste food, there'd be enough for everyone. If only people ate more healthily, there wouldn't be so much pressures on the NHS. If parents fed their children better, they'd be able to concentrate at school, etc., etc. But the fact is that what people eat, or actually don't eat, has always been determined by quite a complex interplay of social, economic and technological forces. It's part and parcel of that society that we live in. You can't abstract food, therefore, from capitalism. Food is big business, extremely big business, as we're going to find out, and the bottom line is profit, regardless of the impact on health, the environment, workers or animals. So I want to argue, really, that of course we want individuals to make the best food choices possible, but that choice is not in a vacuum. That so-called choice is shaped by that wider society. And let's remember, food is a class issue. It's working class people in particular that get stigmatised for not making the right choices. And actually, even at its most basic, having enough money for food. The fact is there is enough food for everyone, not only in Britain, but across the world, yet people starve or are forced to use food banks. So I want to explore some of these topics. It's a very big topic, so I'm sure I might not cover everything people want. Hopefully we can discuss those things as well afterwards. But people might have read a book called Fast Food Nation by Eric Schlosser, one of the first books about food, out about 15 years ago. And he said, what we eat has changed more in the last 40 years than in the previous 40,000 years. And the biggest changes have been in the amount of processed foods that we eat, from takeaways to ready meals. Ready meals. Frozen ready meal, invented in the 1950s in America, when a company found itself with a bit too much turkey after Thanksgiving, decided to package it all up in an aluminium tray and you could eat out of it as well. We didn't even get our first chilled ready meal until 1979 in Britain, when Marks and Spencer's introduced the chicken Kiev. But now, there are 3 billion ready meals eaten in the UK alone every year, and the market keeps growing. Something like the combined frozen foods and ready meals market is worth over £3 billion. Not only the number of ready meals gone up, massive increase in eating away from home. Just imagine, in 1948, McDonald's only had one restaurant. 2015, it had 36,000 restaurants in 119 countries, serving 69 million customers a day. Or you think about supermarkets, how we buy our food's changed. They didn't even exist until the 1960s. The first Walmart in the USA opened in 1962. Something like now, 80% of the UK's grocery spend is in one supermarket or another. I think this gives a bit of a glimpse, doesn't it, of just how big business food has become. The fast food giants like McDonald's or KFC, the supermarkets, and then also the massive food processing companies that supply them, all of which operate on this global scale, driven forward by vast profits to be made from what they call in the industry adding value to food. Essentially, it's quite simple food, you take the cheap ingredients, you process it, you sell it for much more than the sum of its parts. Quite obvious when you look at ready meals and fast food, but actually they're constantly looking for new ways to add value, as they call it. None of our food is off limits here. Much more of our food is industrially processed in some way. You might think, I avoid the ready meals, I don't eat chicken nuggets, I don't eat takeaway. Actually, though, it's quite hard to avoid. There are lots of less obvious processed foods, many of which even pretend to be healthy. Washed salads, smoothies, yogurts, cheese, bread, fruit juice, prepared vegetables, all processed in some way. How and why have such big changes come about then? And it's worth just going back to see why our food has changed so much in these 40, 50 years. Well, in the 1950s, really there was a revolution in food processing in the post-war period. The 1950s were called the golden age of food processing. Sales of fridges, freezers, kitchen appliances soared, and it meant the market for frozen and chilled products began to develop in that way. Technological changes made it possible to produce processed foods that could last a lot longer. One very important example, HFCS, I'm sure people have heard of it, high fructose corn syrup, developed in the early 1970s, made from corn, 6 times sweeter than cane sugar, much cheaper. And by the late 1970s, mass production techniques made its use widespread. And it meant that the cost of producing any high sugar item could be slashed. You know, when Coke and Pepsi started using HFCS, their cost was slashed by 20%. It has a lot of other chemical uses, though. You can use it in frozen foods, protect against freezer burn, in all the long-life products, like in vending machines, it keeps them fresh tasting. Even in bakery products like your rolls, you know, it keeps them looking brown, like just come out of the oven, things like that. Obviously, as well, these go hand in hand with mass production techniques, really. Food industry copy those techniques used in other industries that use the assembly line rules, everything broken down into component parts. And at the same time, actually farmers in this post-war period, particularly in the US, were and actually still are encouraged to grow very essential ingredients for processed foods through direct payments and subsidies. Like in the 1970s, in particular in the US, farmers encouraged to grow corn, led to an explosion of production. And actually, these were the things that were at the heart of processed foods. It helped fuel new development and sales. It made them more affordable. And this actually policy has continued. Massive subsidies for things like corn, rice, wheat and soya which are at the heart of processed food. Just in the period 5 years up to 2001, if you looked at US agricultural subsidies, they were $165 billion, and 5 crops amounted to 90% of that money: corn, rice, wheat, soya and cotton. But all of those apart from cotton in processed food. These were not going to some small farmers struggling to make a living. They were help fuel the growth of these massive multinationals whose ingredients are at the heart of a lot of food that we eat. And of course, alongside these technological changes, government policies, there's been changes in the post-war period to the workforce, working hours and family life. You know, the long working hours have actually made ready meals and processed food and fast food a necessity. It's not really a surprise. The countries that consume the most of these in the Western world are the US and Britain, countries with the longest working hours in the West. And all this has led to really colossal companies. This industrialisation, really, of food production led to colossal companies with global reach. You know, at the very top of this food industrial complex, like I said, there are massive supermarkets and fast food giants who have global purchasing power, which really actually enables them to squeeze their suppliers and reshape whole industries. So, for example, in 2015, McDonald's was the biggest producer in the world of biggest purchaser in the world of beef, pork, potatoes, lettuce and tomatoes, and the second biggest buyer of chicken after KFC. Now that gives McDonald's a lot of clout, doesn't it? You know, he's buying on a massive scale. It doesn't want to deal with hundreds of little small-scale suppliers. It will only deal with the biggest producers and processors to meet their demands for product uniformity and standardisation. And so these are very big contracts to be had with, you know, companies like McDonald's, and there's a lot of cutthroat competition. Only the biggest producers and processors can survive. And so you see the food industry is very characterised by takeovers and mergers. I mean that we've ended up with these giant food processors that supply the big names that we know. And they're often companies that we've never heard of. They're very, very hidden. They often source from other companies themselves and use lots of subsidiaries surrounded by secrecy. So it's hard to keep up. But it's worth looking at some of those suppliers and processors. Just giving the example of McDonald's, it's the largest purchaser of beef in the US. In 1968, it bought its beef from 175 local suppliers. By 2001, it was buying from just 5 suppliers. And so you really see this process of hundreds of small meatpacking firms being driven out of business, being bought up by these large corporate rivals. And by the time you get to 2015, just 4 meatpacking companies process 80% of US beef. This is massive. And the scale is big. I mean, the biggest was in 2015 was Tyson Foods. Its beef sales in a year were $16 billion. It was processing, as it calls it, 175,000 cattle per week. But you learn something else when you look at these companies. You learn that for many of these food processing companies, food is just one of many business ventures. One of these other top 4 beef processors in the US is called National Beef. It's a subsidiary of a company called Leucadia National. Leucadia has lots of subsidiaries that engages in mining and drilling, telecommunications, healthcare, manufacturing, banking, lending, real estate, does it all. Food is just one part. The other thing as well is that one of these 4 biggest beef processors that supplied McDonald's was a company called Cargill. Now, anyone heard of Cargill here? Oh, good, a few people have. Because you should remember that name, because once you start reading about food, it comes up again and again. It literally has a finger in every pie. I mean, it's big in beef. Like I said, its term is it harvests more than 8 million cattle a year. 8 billion pounds of boxed beef produced, but in no way limited to beef. I mean, I read one source that all the eggs used in McDonald's in the US pass through Cargill. But it's also at the heart of producing the essentials for processed foods. And it's one of the world's largest private corporations. In 2015, its sales were over $120 billion, employs 150,000 people in 70 different countries, trades everything from cotton to animal feed, meat, cocoa and salt. It even has 500 ships of its own to distribute all its product around the world. But it's very secretive. It doesn't really reveal very much, but you get a sense. It had to give a testimony to the US Senate in 1999. And there, it admitted it controlled 45% of the global grain trade, 42% of US corn exports, a third of all soya bean exports, and 20% of wheat exports. All the foods at the heart of processed food. And it's the world's largest crusher of oilseeds, such as soya and rapeseed. Like I say, it doesn't really publish its accounts. It's very secretive, probably concentrated its areas even further. But I just want to make the point. Companies like Cargill, didn't get big through their own efforts. They were actually helped very much by the US government. Because remember we said about the US government giving massive subsidies? Well, Cargill was one of the beneficiaries. It meant they could sell corn and wheat at prices below the cost of production. And it also meant they could then export and capture the domestic market of other countries, especially in the developing world. Actually, Cargill worked directly with US government representatives and negotiators at the World Trade Organization, the World Bank and the IMF to force those countries to open up their markets to agricultural exports from the US. Once they did so, companies like Cargill go in and outcompete all the local farmers. Their grain was so cheap, nobody could compete. But just like the fast food giants, the supermarkets only want to deal with big suppliers. I don't know if anyone heard the radio today, but they were talking about the dairy industry, and they talked about a company called Arla. Asda only has one supplier for milk, and that is Arla in Britain. It says it's one of the world's largest dairy companies. It owns the brands like Lurpak, Castello, Anchor, Cravendale. To help supply Asda, it built the world's largest fresh milk facility in Aylesbury. Same story as the meatpacking industry in the US. Thousands of dairy farmers have been driven out of business in the UK, really because the supermarkets use milk as a way to compete. They want the lowest price possible to get customers in. They pass on those price cuts to the farmer, who've got no choice to try and squeeze their costs, much bigger herds of cattle, the intensification of production, the knock-on effect in terms of animal welfare, and actually the quality of product. Now, I suspect when we talk about supermarkets, probably a lot of people here are very familiar with the massive pressures that they are able to then exert on their suppliers in terms of the price that they'll pay them, the quantity demanding, their exacting standards of uniformity and cosmetic perfection. You know, we've probably heard the stories about apples photographed 70 times as they go through the conveyor belt to make sure their blush is in the right place before they can be on the supermarket shelves, or a carrot, if it's misshaped, is rejected. There's very few written contracts, actually, between supermarkets and their suppliers. They're expected to just respond to demand almost immediately. It means actually that massive waste is built into the system right from the start, you know, to crops that don't make the grade, to ones that the supermarket decides that there's no demand, we don't want it. Of course, this is not the image that supermarkets want to give. And when it comes to fresh produce, you know, you'd be forgiven for thinking that supermarkets were very committed to supporting small British farms. because most supermarkets actually brand their salads and vegetables as coming from a farm. Most of these don't actually exist. Last year, it was found that all the farms that Tesco advertised on its packaging for its new range of farm foods, Redmere Farms, Nightingale Farms, Woodside Farms, they all sound very nice, they're entirely made up. All the produce, from blueberries, sprouts, mushrooms, carrots, were from manufacturers with no relation to the names on the packaging. Some of the food was imported from overseas, and they were just given British names to make it sound more local. I was actually quite confused about this myself, because I picked up some peppers from Redmere Farms, found out they were from Israel. It's completely... And this is really, part of this is because these so-called farms really aren't what we'd imagine anymore. They're actually, a lot of the time, massive industrial complexes with pack houses, where, yes, of course, some crops are grown, but they also fly in product from around the world and process it in some way before shipping it off to the supermarkets. They have to do that. They've had to do it to be able to get the contracts with the supermarkets. And if they're going to supply them and meet their demands, have to fly in products sometimes from all over the world to meet the just-in-time delivery systems. If you remember, earlier this year, there was a bit of a shortage. The crop failed, actually, in Europe of courgette, spinach and lettuce. They actually had to fly it in from the US to meet the supermarket's demands. And then you come to the actual food manufacturers, the ones that make the actual ready meals. And they're massive as well. I mean, actually, in 2013, there were only 25 major chilled food companies in the UK, with just 100 very streamlined production sites. Actually, these food manufacturing factories really resemble oil plants or car plants or oil refineries. They're not some scaled-up version of a nice domestic kitchen, no matter how much they claim it's all been lovingly prepared just for you. There are highly efficient assembly lines. And, they don't talk of food in the industry. They talk of product. It's not cooking, but manufacture. It's not ingredients, but food ingredient systems. In these factories, sauces are cooked by the ton in vast temperature-controlled vats and, poured onto other components on a conveyor belt. So it's not just the ready meal you imagine. It's, soups, baby foods, tomato sauces, all those things produced in this way, and on a massive scale. One ready meals company says its factory manufactures 10 tons of chicken tikka a day. Another one said it made 2.5 million meals a week. Big scale. So I would say that it's not maybe a surprise, but this model of food production and distribution has a few problems. We're taking something essential for life here and putting it in the hands of a few massive corporations whose aim is not to give us healthy food at affordable prices, but to maximise their profits. And they're in cutthroat competition with each other, constantly looking to cut their costs. And their sheer scale gives them massive lobbying power over governments and the food standard agencies. I think when you put it like that, it's very clear it's not going to end very well here. And it's an obvious thing to say, but processed food in itself is bad for us. Actually, food manufacturers combine ingredients. They don't occur in those combinations in natural food, notably the trilogy of sugar, processed fat, and salt. Actually, we have no physiological need for sugar at all. It causes lots of big problems. But we've been encouraged to consume more and more of it. In fact, in the early 2000s, again, encouraged by EU and US subsidies, there was record sugarcane and sugar beet output from the largest producers. And in addition, the production of sugars from grains like maize and wheat. When you see things like dextrose and fructose and maltose and glucose on the label, you are talking about some form of processed sugar. And you might think, well, okay, I don't have sugar in my tea. I don't really consume sugar. The thing is, 3/4 of the sugar used in Britain goes directly to the industrial users who add it to food in some way. It's been a massive sweetening of our diet, almost without us being conscious of it. Sugar is used in actually loads of processed foods, even like things like crisps and salty foods, it can be part of. And again, the industrial users of sugar who put it in are massive. Guess whose name comes up again? Cargill. Cargill trades and ships 6.5 million tonnes of raw sugar a year. And it also controls a massive chunk of the market in sweeteners from grains. And the sugar industry has a massive lobbying power to suppress all the studies and the evidence that perhaps we should be cutting down on it. And it's utilised that, and people are nodding probably know about that. Alongside, also worth saying it's been the biggest, sugar was the largest agricultural donor to political campaigns in the US. And alongside this, we could go through the story of fat, which I don't have time to do, where really in just a generation, we've gone from eating quite natural fats like butter to quite processed, chemically altered fats, the advice of which keeps changing. But it's not even just the actual ingredients, the whole process of food production, you know, freezing the raw food, transporting it long distances, chopping, refreezing it, cooking it in industrial quantities, it destroys lots of the flavour and texture. So it all has to be added back in. So there's a whole industry devoted to flavourings, flavour technology systems as they're called. And it's not just the flavours you want to add back in, it's actually the ones you want to hide. There's a lot of off flavours apparently come from the manufacturing process, you know, including chemicals, packaging, the additives. And the industry actually is quite open about this. They offer things like customised masking solutions for tastes you want to hide. So it becomes quite hard actually to avoid the over 6,000 food additives that exist in the forms of flavourings, glazing agents, improvers, anti-caking agents, all sorts of things that you can see. The thing is though, is that obviously we, the consumer, people, we're not always so happy about this, are we? We don't really like to see ingredient lists with lots of E numbers and long chemical names on. It started to become a problem for some of the food manufacturers. So they've come up with a new concept. It's called clean label, where essentially they remove the food additives from the ingredient list and replace it with what would seem to be more simple and recognisable ingredients that don't sound artificial or chemical. And actually, they've hit on this idea, you can charge more for it because it sounds natural and healthy. Actually, in reality, these are just as bad, even though they're made to sound natural. And then there's things called processing aids. They're used in production, but they're not actually ingredients, they don't get listed at all. And Joanna Blythman, who's, I don't know if her books are here, she's a food writer. She identified something she came across called nature seal, which you dip your fruit and vegetable in, and it extends their shelf life for 21 days. You know, it means your carrots aren't going to go white and your cut apples don't go brown and fruits don't all go mushy and ooze. But actually, nature seal is a processing aid. It's not an ingredient. There's no need to declare it on the label, but there's obviously some chemicals in that. It's extending the shelf life for 21 days. But they've got no obligation to tell their consumers their fresh fruit salad may be a few weeks old. So I would say in this, you can get a glimpse of how we're all eating prepared foods that are made using state-of-the-art food manufacturing technology, but we don't really know always what we're eating, either because the ingredients aren't properly on the list, they're covered up with other words, they're not listed on the label, or the word natural is used to cover it up a little bit in that way. Even fruit and vegetables in their raw, unaltered state don't escape processing and the supermarket's industrial systems. They have giant washing machines. One is called the Weimar Veggie Polisher. These are to wash and polish your carrots so that when they're displayed on the supermarket shelf, even weeks after washing, it will still look like wet, fresh ones. It basically removes the surface membrane, polishes the carrots. They use it on potatoes and all sorts. And actually, the story of salad itself can shed a light on many aspects of our food production system, because what could seem healthier and less processed than some fresh salad? How could this be harming us or our environment? But the law of adding value applies to everything in the food industry, and not even simple salad can escape. I mean, actually, bagged salad didn't even exist before 1992. Now it's bought regularly. In the first 10 years of its existence, the value of the UK salad vegetable market grew by 90%, worth over £1 billion by 2002, and then things really took off. It wasn't that we're eating 90% more salad. Actually, volumes only grew by 18%. It was just that they were making a lot more money out of it. But actually, in this period, when it takes off, there's actually a massive increase in food poisoning outbreaks associated with ready-to-eat salad and prepared fruit and veg. In fact, actually, one person died as a result of salmonella poisoning from eating lettuce in Britain. And partly this as well is about the presence of E. coli bugs. Now, often these are spread from human or animal feces. And in food, you know, you can imagine they come from unwashed hands of people working in farms, pack houses, or manure that's not been properly composted, or from contaminated water. The problem is that the whole system of employment that prevails in the food industry works against decent conditions and hygienic conditions for workers. Often it's the very opposite. One of the things is it relies massively on migrant workers in Britain, but also abroad, where a lot of our salad comes from. In fact, one of the biggest changes in the last 40 years, when we look at what's changed in food, is the availability of all sorts of vegetables and salad, whatever the season. It means that once they're finished growing in Britain, salad crop production switches to the south of Spain, grown in massive polytunnels which cover the land for miles. Most of the labour to grow those crops in Spain comes from migrant workers from Africa. living in the most inhumane conditions, in shacks with no running water, no electricity, literally wait by the side of the road every day to see if they're going to be picked up for work. Actually, a recent survey described it as like modern-day slavery. This is a consequence of the supermarket distribution system. You know, they want labour, they can just turn on and off and pick a crop when they need it. But you can imagine this doesn't impact well on all the work that's going on. And as well as needing cheap labour, the industry also relies massively on chemical pest and disease control. You know, the supermarkets demand pristine salad leaves. You know, a tiny aphid will mean that the whole lot gets junked, really. So there's a massive increase in pesticide use. Most lettuces will have some pesticide residue, and it's like a vicious circle. The more pesticides you use, the more resistance builds up, you have to use even more. Lettuces might have like 12 doses of pesticide and fertiliser as well. To get rid of this, they wash it all in chlorine vats of water. Chlorine itself is very bad for us. The dirt builds up in there as well, leading to the problems we're talking about. And then it will be dried and packaged and sorted in plastic, where they alter the oxygen and carbon inside to prevent it deteriorating. It can be flown around the world in this way. I think this whole process actually of salad production, processing and distribution also shows how all of our food industry is completely tied to fossil fuels. You know, you think about these plastic polytunnels that cover some of Britain and whole swathes of southern France and actually parts of southern Europe, to all the plastic packaging, use fruit and veg and everything in that way, to actually all the pesticides and agrochemicals that are used. You know, most farmers, whatever their crop, will probably be using one of those major companies that dominate the market to buy agrochemicals and their seeds. Last year, there was 6 global chemical and seed giants, and they accounted for 3/4 of the agrochemical market. And they've become 3, I think, now. Monsanto and Bayer merged in a deal. DuPont and Dow Chemical did a deal. So you've got like very massive companies controlling the pesticides, the fertilisers, the agrochemicals that farmers have come to rely on. Again, it's absolutely worth noting that just like with the production of grain and wheat and soya and corn, these companies that dominate this sphere were also helped by the US government. Actually, a lot of them had a lot of investment put into them during the Second World War. Government money was injected into the chemical and plastics industry as part of the war effort. After that, they sold off these state-of-the-art technology to all these private companies at rock-bottom prices. They got a massive injection of investment, essentially, and it made that they were able to shape the whole industry around it and force others along a similar path of development, all connected to the oil industry. And not only the environmental impact of pesticides and fertilisers, fossil fuels appear at all stages of the industrialised food chain. You know, you think about the massive air miles and trucking. You know, I was talking about lettuce being flown in from the US. You know, it takes 127 calories of fuel energy to fly just 1 food calorie of that lettuce to the UK from California. Or you think of all the new roads that got built during the 1990s to ensure that produce from Spain and Portugal and Italy could reach us in the winter months. A 90% increase in the 1990s in the movement of all the food products between the UK and Europe. And people have heard of the crazy examples. I always like this one because it is my favourite, but shows what the system's like. Chives, grown in the UK, flown to Kenya to be tied around vegetable bundles and then flown back to the UK. Or I found an example of a Swedish tomato ketchup, made from tomatoes grown in Italy, packaged in bags made in the Netherlands, driven to Sweden to be put in bottles made in the UK and Sweden, from materials made in Japan, Italy, Belgium, the US and Denmark, with caps made from Denmark, and transported to Sweden by road freight. I mean, the air miles in just that one bottle are colossal, really. And also the energy actually used in industrial food processing is massive. 7,000 kilocalories of fuel energy just to process a typical medium-sized box of breakfast cereal that would only just give you over 1,000 kilocalories of food energy. Massive amounts of energy to make it all. But at the end of the day, aren't all these big companies, the supermarkets, the fast food companies, the processors, aren't they just giving us what we want? Just responding to our demand? Well, I would say that just like any other industry, the food industry has been very adept at creating demand. And it does this in so many ways, and we might want to discuss it more. One of the ways is actually getting children to eat processed food from a very young age, when their taste buds are still developing to get a taste for it, if you like. Start with babies. Babies actually, it's found, retain a liking for food that they're weaned on. and often now are weaned on things like baby rice, recommended by professionals. Essentially, if you like, pure white starch from a grain that's had most of its nutrients removed by processing, graduate onto processed baby foods. It takes their palates into a whole new direction than would have been the case previous. Actually, a lot of them are very sweet. You know, it's not actual sugar in British baby foods, but other sugars processed from processed concentrated fruit are there. And it means this whole sweetening of our taste buds and diet continues. And this is in addition to all the advertising and marketing, particularly to children, of fast food and processed foods, you know, trying to get them to eat the sort of food that's got fat and salt and sugar in it. But also some of it's psychological, isn't it? You know, McDonald's says it likes to create the happy meal, to conjure up good memories of childhood, so you keep returning to McDonald's in adult life. Whole industry of giveaway toys, product placement, linking with cartoon or film characters. You know, mass marketing is absolutely key role in sustaining our demand for a lot of different foods. It's also true that a lot of our so-called food choices, like eating meat or chicken, were not a question really of demand as such, but actually it was very profitable for the industry to get us to eat more. For example, beef production, actually on the grasslands, you know, in America, became very closely associated with the production of grain. We've seen how profitable it was to produce the grain and how subsidised that was. But actually, because it was so profitable to produce beef with this grain, there was a big campaign in the 1950s to get people to eat more beef. You know, it may be that you think you're making a free choice to eat hamburgers, but there was a massive effort to get people to do so in America. Or you could look at poultry. Mass production models of rearing poultry in the US by the 1970s meant that the industry was producing far more chicken than people typically ate. Just to give you an example of the scale of this as well. Before the Second World War, really, you know, poultry was a backyard operation. There was probably about 300 million chickens, and the flock size average was about 70. By the early 2000s, there was something like 9 billion broiler chickens in total, and the average flock size was 30,000 birds. I mean, these are massive concentrates of birds in one place. But it's very profitable, but there's a limit to how many roast chickens people would eat. You know, probably eat one roast chicken maybe a week. So this is why with the food science and all the marketing, the poultry industry repackaged chicken in a whole number of ways. You know, chicken nuggets, chicken strips for salads, using it for things like cat food as well. You know, there's so many uses for chicken now, isn't there? So you can see how it constantly tries to develop new products. So to finish off, what I've really tried to do is give a bit of a glimpse into the global food industry. Like I said, there is a lot to discuss, and I hope people are going to raise their own issues that they'd like to bring to it, really. But the more you look at it, the clearer it seems that food that is both unhealthy and destructive for the environment is not a straightforward consequence of consumer choice, but actually a result of corporate interests backed up by governments and politicians. You know, we have this food system driven by profit, dominated by vast multinationals, and really industrialised food production techniques which have an immense impact on the actual quality of our food, never mind everything else. And like I say, massive waste built into the system, and it's locked into fossil fuel use. I think when you look at it in this way, the solution is not about the individual dietary changes, but the radical transformation of the food system itself. And I think if we just concentrate on individuals, you actually move away from what collective solutions that there can be. Because actually there are lots of battles over food. There's battles at every level. Battles over access to have school dinners. Remember Theresa May and the Tories wanted to get rid of them, didn't they, in the recent election? The quality of school dinners that our children get was highlighted by Jamie Oliver a few years ago and led to massive campaigns. There's been big campaigns to stop yet more supermarkets getting built or to stop GM crops being grown in Britain. Sometimes, though, battles over food can start over other issues, but they can shine a light on the nature of food production. Like when you remember a few years ago, workers at Hovis in Wigan went on strike against 0 hours. Actually, they created a crumpet crisis because they couldn't get the bread around the country in time. Or you think of fast food workers like McDonald's and places like that fighting against low pay for the £10 an hour. They give an insight into the nature of the food system, but they also give a glimpse of the potential power to change it as well. Because when you think about those people who work in food, the supermarket workers, there is a potential collective strength. Because these massive centres of food processing and distribution, I mean, actually, workers there are in a very key position to bring food production and getting it out to the supermarkets to a standstill, hitting the profits of those giant companies that seem to be all dominant. And actually, it's not a separate fight to a lot of the other things that we're fighting over on lots of issues, whether that's over pay, long hours, health and safety, quality of life in general. I would very much argue the nature of food production is being driven forward by the logic of capitalism, the logic that profit comes before all else. I think we have to fight to resist that logic in the here and now and fight for the best food choices we can have. It makes a difference what we do, but ultimately I think we have to have an absolute root and branch transformation of that whole food system.
Hello, I'm Robert. I work as a maintenance assistant at the Church's Hospital in Tooting, but I have in the past worked in the food industry. For example, a few years ago I worked on a salmon farm, and sort of fresh caught salmon is built as fresh, healthy food, but I saw it's not like that at all. For example, natural salmon isn't bright pink. They put colouring in the feed to make it pink. Salmon is naturally sort of white or light brown. Basically the feed is all full of vegetable oil to make them fatten up faster. Basically they're locked up in a cage and you can't swim, so it's not actually proper fish meat you're actually eating, and plus it's all covered in chemicals. You have to completely dose them with lice, so therefore it's all, so what you're eating is all got chemicals in it. And the second is want to ask a question about this single European market and how that's affected food production in Eastern Europe. And because I believe a lot of these subsidies and all the farming land is owned by multinational corporations, and I believe the single European market has played a part in that. I don't believe the small farmers have benefited from the single European market.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Carol, and hasn't the topic of food always been a political issue? Think of the Irish potato famine, how this absolutely changed everything. I was pretty lucky. When I was a kid, my dad worked for a company that it imported and exported spices. And my dad was very, very popular because he was allowed to take home samples. And one of the samples was of pepper. So everybody on my little street used to come to our parents, and he used to share out his samples of pepper, because the food, although we look back nostalgically, wasn't particularly nice. And it was certainly improved by a bit of pepper. Now, I was speaking to the lady next door, sitting next to me, and she said, I said, weren't school dinners disgusting? And she said, oh, they weren't as bad as that. I was spoiled because I had pepper and anything. It didn't matter what the meal was, I had extra pepper. Now this goes even further. When I was about 14, my dad, for reasons unknown, was sent to Sri Lanka to meet some people where the pepper came from. And he knew his place and sat next to the chauffeur, and he was talking to her and talking to him, and they got to know each other quite well after a few weeks. And Dad said, "May I ask how much you earn?" And he said so. So Dad said, "That's not bad. I earn that in a week as well." The man said, "No, a year." That was when I was 14. And at the end of the time with the chauffeur, Dad gave him enough money to marry 2 daughters. And when he told my brother and I was absolutely disgusted. I said, "Dad, you'd give that to me just as throwaway money." He said, "Well, he could marry." I said, "I think this is disgusting. This is absolutely terrible." And it was on that day that I decided this is unfair, something has to be done, and I became a socialist.
mean, the speakers set out very well how the food that we eat globally, the Western diet, has changed in the last 40 or 50 years. If you look at people's health over the same period of time, it's also changed in a radical way. You had maybe 30 million cases of diabetes in the 60s and 70s. Now you've got between 400 and 600 million cases of diabetes. And it's pretty clear that the reason that's happened is because of the change in the diet. Now, capitalism, big industry, tries to make money, but the government and the advice that the government gives on people's diets has been instrumental in that change. It started in the 70s with US dietary guidelines, which were copied in Western countries. If you look on the NHS website here, it's called Eat Well Plate. And you'll see that a big chunk of it is foods that are high in carbohydrates and starches. And the reason is that goes back to the dietary guidelines. Now, there was a lot of debate over how those would be set out, but basically at the end of the day, it was industry lobbying that set the proportion of carbohydrates in the diet, which has led to the health problems we've got now. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, for instance, I don't know what people have for breakfast, but if you had a breakfast cereal, glass of orange juice, perhaps a round of toast, maybe had some yogurt, healthy yogurt, a low-fat yogurt, you probably ate about 20 teaspoons of sugar, and that means your insulin levels went up. And over a long period of time, high insulin levels are very, very bad for people's health. And more research has been done, which has shown not only does high amounts of carbohydrates in the diet cause diabetes, they also cause other chronic diseases, maybe even cancers that are associated with obesity. And it's very difficult. It's like an oil tanker that's going in a dietary oil tanker that's going in a particular direction. It's very difficult to change that direction. I'm not quite sure what the answer is to it. Someone said that man is the only creature that's clever enough to invent its own food, and then stupid enough to eat it. And I think that about sums it up.
Well, people have spoken a lot about how food and agriculture has changed since sort of the Second World War. I think it's worth also kind of adding that Karl Marx actually spoke about agriculture even when he was writing 150 years ago. So he referred to metabolism, for example, how we all have to have a metabolic relationship between ourselves and the natural environment, regulated by human labour, something that's always happened throughout human history. But with the start of capitalism, we're alienated from our own ability to labour, and with that alienation you get a metabolic rift, alienated from our food and our relationship with the environment as well. So Marx talked about, for example, about capitalism degrading both the soil and the worker at the same time. And I guess being a contradictory kind of system, capitalism also undermines its own conditions of reproduction. So one example of that is that there's a massive almond industry in California, which has created a bee industry. They're moving bees around on an industrial scale in massive vans, but the almonds, because they use so much pesticides and fertilisers on them, they're also killing off the bees and making it harder and harder to continue growing that. So I think what it points to is that it's capitalism that's ultimately the problem, before reforms, but the roots of our terrible relationship with food really go back to the start of capitalism, and that workers, including agricultural workers, are really key to changing things.
Just to add to something the previous speaker said, I mean, if you look at Marx and Engels' work, it has a developing analysis of both food and agriculture in it. That Engels, in Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, talks about how food is systematically adulterated. So he talks about how cocoa, for example, has mutton fat added to it to make it cheaper for the producer. And then Marx writes about this in a much more systematic way in Capital, about how bread and so on is adulterated. He talks about the excrescence of abscesses and human sweat and cockroaches and so on being added to bread, which is why lots of people had an antipathy to brown bread, because it was easier to hide things in brown bread rather than white bread, which was kept mainly for the rich. But Marxism isn't just, to make more money from it, but it's also structured into the way, because you pay workers, the whole of capitalism pays workers enough for them to turn up the next day. If you can cheapen the costs of food, this benefits bosses across the whole of the system. And therefore, it's absolutely linked to the development of the profit system that you have this systematic adulteration of food. And I think it's important to say that as socialists, as Marxists, this is a topic which people in our tradition have been writing about for 175 years, have always understood this as a crucial part of it. Just one other thing, food is very much a weapon of war and a weapon of imperialism. If you think about what's happening in Yemen at the moment, an appalling crime is being committed against the people of Yemen by the government of Saudi Arabia, supported by arms supplied by the British and the Americans, with a deliberate famine created in Yemen, which is affecting millions of people. And this is a continuation of a process which has always been used. Someone mentioned, Carol mentioned what happened in Ireland, the deliberate creation of famine in Ireland. Again and again, this is how imperialism works and has used food as a way in which it's able to carry out its disgusting manoeuvres.
While you were talking, I was thinking mainly about dehumanisation and alienation, and particularly alienation because I think it's a key Marxist idea. And I was thinking of examples in my life of that. First one being the time I worked in a chicken factory very long ago, and the experience of working in such a disgusting place. If you treat animals like that, then you'll treat humans like that as well. We are animals. The second thing being that I've been living in southern Spain part of the time recently, and you're quite right about the huge greenhouses, polytunnels that cover the whole of the area down there. They look appalling. They're real blots on the landscape, and one of the interesting things to me was that you hardly ever see an insect down there. I'm sure the two things are related, as well as your comments about people working in them. And that's alienating to us to have to live in a landscape like that and to destroy our world like that. But the third thing is a silly example of going to IKEA a few weeks ago and eating a hot dog there, which I think is the nearest to an example of Margaret Atwood's Future World or Soylent Green that I've ever come across. I actually really enjoyed it, but only by smothering it with mustard and tomato ketchup. It's the most ersatz food I've ever eaten. And in a way, we are being conditioned into getting used to eating food that isn't food. And if there's a good description of alienation, I think that's probably one of them.
I live in Turkey, and I was fascinated to hear the name of the Cargill company, because I thought they just did seeds. Because if you go to the northwest of Turkey is covered in sunflower fields, which are grown to make oil. And you just, if you drive through there or pass through there, you just see the name Cargill on all the fields. And actually 90% of the sunflower seed to grow these flowers is provided by Cargill. And you think, well, just a minute, the flowers produce seeds, and the seeds are used to make oil. So why don't the farmers just keep some of the seeds and plant them next year? I actually had a friend in Turkey who was growing flowers and trying to do this with flower seeds. And what happens is, of course, if you take the seeds out of the flowers, they don't breed true. They're what they call F1 hybrids. which is a trick which they do. The seed they sell is made by hybridizing two pure breeds of the plant which they keep secret. And so they have a way of producing a seed that you can't use, you can't save some, as farmers always used to do in the past, and plant it again the next year, so you can't make your own seeds. And now 90% of all the sunflower oil that's produced in Turkey is produced from seeds supplied by the Cargill company. And it's just like a patent, except patents run out in 30 years. But the Cargill company's monopoly on F1 hybrid sunflower seeds never runs out. It's permanent because it's achieved by this technical trick, and it means that they have a permanent source of profit from all of the sunflowers being grown all over the world. And then, of course, the massive interest in increasing the use of sunflower oil, and for a long time, of course, sunflower seed oil was being turned into trans fats by chemically transforming it to make hard fat, which we then found out was terribly, terribly, terribly bad for our health, and that there's no safe amount of trans fat that you can consume. So that's another example.
I think Amy touched on it a little bit about the global south and their dependency on Western farmers, thank you. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of food sovereignty, because it's something that I've actually been learning about. So basically capitalism is, as we know, really ruthless in its pursuit of profit. And one of the ways that it kind of creates dependency in the global south is by selling seeds to local farmers. So basically you get these local farmers who become dependent on these seeds, and then they can't break out of this cycle. But actually one of the good things to come out of that horrible situation is that there's a global movement that was formed in 1993 called La Via Campesina. It encompasses 20 million farmers, or it claims to represent 200 million farmers. And basically they have brought this concept of food sovereignty to sort of the public sphere. And that's kind of the idea that people have the right to healthy, culturally appropriate food that is, and they also get to dictate their own food system, because you get situations where in the global south, farmers are growing food that they can't even actually consume themselves, and obviously treated really badly by these massive companies. So yeah, I just wanted to mention La Via Campesina. They have quite a good online presence. They're recognised by the UN and other people like that. And you can actually go online and sign their petition and support them that way, and kind of get that out there for everyone, so that they know that they have support from the West as well.
There's a great book by an American Marxist anthropologist called Sidney Mintz, who died quite recently, called Sweetness and Power. And in that book, part of his argument is that the development of industrialism and manufacture took place partly in the Caribbean around the production of sugar, and that this, of course, the labour was supplied by slave labour, but that as part of the triangle trade, the sugar was brought to the UK, where it transformed the production and mill production and the development of the working class in Britain, because it provided such an intense energy source that it meant the entire family were able to go to work on a cup of sweet tea and then a drink of sweetened chocolate. And of course this wasn't a recipe for living long, but it was a recipe for the entire family to work, and the, if you like, the super profits that enabled the primitive accumulation of capital in the UK. So that this a really interesting relationship. We turn that round now, because of course that energy was all being used up. That kind of diet we still have, but of course we don't go out and labour manually. I want to just come back to one of the points people made about food being the cause of diabetes. Of course, it isn't just food. It's our whole way we work. So we live sedentary lives. We have a high energy intake. Practically all food you buy has sugar in it now. I won't go into the details, but the final point I wanted to make is we actually have to transform the whole work process, right? And that's why Amy's point about we can only change our diet through the, revolutionary liberation of society through workers' power.
If you ask anybody why food is produced, I think most people will say to meet the needs of human beings to live, to eat to live. And it's quite clear from Amy's talk and the contributions that food production is anything but. Food production is to meet the needs of capitalists, to maximise the profit as much as possible. And we've had some really good contributions about the effect of particularly overdosing on sugar on people's health. Absolutely appalling. Now, I come from Huddersfield, and as people are probably aware, the government has produced these STPs, social and transformation plans, to push through cuts in healthcare. And part of the STPs is to ration healthcare. This sort of culture of blame where they say if you're ill, it's your fault because you don't have a healthy diet. If you're obese, it's your fault. And they want to ration people's healthcare on the basis of obesity. And in Huddersfield, they've passed the actual cuts then down to the CCGs to sort of distance themselves from these health cuts. But Huddersfield CCG, I think, is one of maybe the first area to say they're going to start to implement that. So, it's bad enough that the food industry makes us ill, but it's even worse. It's even worse because when you are ill, they then are saying, but we won't treat you, we won't give you health care. And it's absolutely fundamental that we have to just, you can't do it piecemeal. We've got to challenge the whole system, and there's only one solution: revolution.
Got time for a few more questions or contributions. We'll get Amy to come and sum up. Yeah, at the back there. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of sort of brief points about the knock-on effect of some of these food policies. The first one is with regard to sugar, that's been mentioned a number of times. In the United States, at federal and state level, it's a colossal amount of subsidies, people's money, goes into the sugar industry. And that's bad enough. These are private companies, supposedly even private enterprise. Why do they need subsidies at all? But then, of course, federal and state government has to pay a second time to put right the problems of diabetes and obesity. So with federal and state funding or spending in the United States being so low in the first place, you've got the problem that what's a very small tranche of public spending is being given over in a double whammy twice to the sugar industry. Firstly, an undeserved subsidy, and secondly, another effective second subsidy, putting the problem that they caused right. Of course, lots of people die as well. And the second example is, we talked about industrialised agriculture, but particularly things like cattle production have this other double whammy effect. You get colossal amounts of methane and N2O produced, firstly by the cows themselves in the horrible conditions they're kept under, and secondly, huge amounts of nitrogen fertiliser have to be used in the countries of the world to produce massively inefficient large amounts of crops to feed the cows. So you get a triple whammy. Firstly, massive subsidies to the cattle industry. Secondly, colossal amounts of climate change, which we're all going to have to pay for because of the colossal amount of methane and N2O that goes into this intensive production. That's the most intensive, damaging form of climate change you can imagine. And secondly, thirdly, all sorts of other environmental problems, because of course it contributes to species destruction, because you have to have huge fields to grow all this food. And you also get all sorts of other types of non-greenhouse gas pollution as well. So what we're talking about is when you actually start to subsidise an industry which is both exploitative of labour and bad for our health, it's not simply that you're wasting money on something that's immoral in the first place, it's that it's got knock-on effect after knock-on effect after knock-on effect, so that in reality, these industries are causing us colossal harm, not just in what they do, but all the knock-on effects of what they do.
Thanks. You'll be the last speaker.
A couple of quick points, really. Is that working? I caught the end of a programme on BBC4 the other night about pigs. And apart from the ethical issues about how animals are treated in factory farming, there were some scientists on there talking about the impact of ramming antibiotics into their food to the extent that it's undermining the antibiotics that we take to protect our own health. Secondarily, the question of austerity. We no longer have a safe food industry in the sense of what you buy in a shop. These places used to get checked regularly by environmental health officers. There was a trading standards looking at food adulteration. All of that has been chopped back massively as a result of the cuts in local government funding. And I think that's another issue that we should all be very concerned about.
That was a great discussion, really, and I was really pleased because people brought out a lot of things I didn't even have time to cover, so that was really, really helpful. Just to come up on some of those, I mean, I think everyone is actually putting this in the context of capitalism as a whole system where profit comes first, and that's how I do think we have to start from looking at this topic. And it's right, you see, two of the speakers brought this out. One of the things that makes me most angry about the questions around food is how food is marketed, it's sold at us, and then we're then blamed for the problems that this has created in our diet, to the environment and everything else. It's working class people that get blamed here, you know, in that way. And like people are saying, being refused treatment because of the so-called choices. And I think we have to therefore not take that approach, but look at it in that bigger context that people are saying. And actually, I'm very glad the last speaker talked about antibiotics, because this is, again, an issue where we get blamed, don't we? You take too many antibiotics, people go to the doctors and demand them all the time, and that's what's meaning that, you know, you've got these resistant viruses and things, developing and stuff. Actually, they are massively used antibiotics across not only the pig industry, but the whole of livestock and farming in that way. I mean, the first speaker spoke about salmon. I mean, he's absolutely right. One of the things, though, massive antibiotic use there. I mean, salmon being farmed in massive cages, not naturally at all, where fed antibiotics to out against disease, all the sludge and everything falls to the bottom of the ocean in the cages and affects much wider sea life and ourselves as well. Actually, you see the scale of this damage, though, because these are massive. I mean, the desire to source salmon for Asda in America meant that they ended up reshaping the whole industry of chili about 10, 15 years ago, where Chile became a massive salmon producer off the shore, and this became one of its number one industries, so it could supply it in that way. Massive business, pumping them full in that way. And people talked about, what does this mean for sort of European countries, you see these big companies are constantly looking for new markets. If you can get into new countries that haven't yet had those sorts of foods, you can expand, can't you, and sell more. I mean, this whole idea of the so-called Western diet is what people are trying to spread, but also find ways to produce. I mean, and one of the interesting things here is about how people often talk about Britain having quite a bad food culture, but often this is linked to some of the stuff people actually brought out about being one of the first countries to industrialise, people torn from the land to the towns and cities, breaking a link with actually how things are produced, and in that way impacts very much then on how food develops. But this is happening to countries, other ones. You know, this process plays out as capitalism spreads across the globe, looking for markets, looking for cheaper ways to produce, looking for the raw materials. And it's definitely something that I was reading about how, you know, Poland still had a lot of places of localised pig production, big companies buying in the land to bring the big scale pig production looking at in that way. And this brings me actually to the meat industry, because people might have noticed that I didn't actually spend loads of time talking about the meat industry, even though this is actually quite subject to a lot of debate at the moment. And like I started saying, at the moment there are quite a lot of arguments about becoming vegan in this way. And the reason I didn't is because partly, I mean, it's true what one of the last contributors said about animal agriculture contributing to climate change, but actually some of the figures that you come across are kind of wildly exaggerated or based on science that can be disproved, particularly around Cowspiracy, which has been a very influential film, actually massively exaggerated the amount of greenhouse gases coming from animal agriculture, although it is a part. But what I was trying to say is that you can't just take one part of the food section and say, if we just solve this part, the rest is fine, because all of it is linked into fossil fuels in the way that we outlined about how it's produced, the packaging, the pesticides, the miles used. You can't just take one aspect and separate that off in that way. But I think, though, and if you want to talk about the meat industry, there's lots of reasons why you might not want to because of how it's produced. But I think for a lot of people, it can feel, because these are such big questions, at least that's something you can do. Do you know what I mean? You can become vegan, you control what goes in your mouth. It can feel like that's the way to get the change that you want. Maybe you can imagine that more, that we could all become vegan, than actually there being big-scale revolutionary change. And so I think for a lot of those people, these are debates that we want to have about how, rather than, you know, we want to be part of those people who want to bring about change around the environment, but engage that this is a part of a bigger picture, but also throw into it where power lies, because there have been changes. You know, people talked about some of the worst ways of both food production and adulteration of food. Actually, these things were fought against. You know, a lot of the worst ways of adulterating food 100 years ago then become outlawed. Now, of course, they found new ways, don't they, to chemically alter and change our food in the ways that I talked about. That's why it's important that we do fight against those. It's a good thing that in Britain people fought against the GM crops, for example, you know, to not and things like that. But we have to find other ways to do that as well. But what we do matters. We're not saying we'll just wait and not bother about our food. It matters now what we do eat. It matters now that we have healthier school dinners, that they're free to access for children, that we fight against the cuts to health and safety. It's true, there's hardly any inspections in Britain of the big food processing companies I was talking about. They just don't expect to get it. They're left to regulate themselves. Actually, they should be inspected, and that's part of those bigger fights. So what I think we have to say is we have to put food in the way that people talked about in that bigger context of the global picture of it, and it's part and parcel of it. Fight for people to have the better choices that they can have, but actually look for where power lies to do it. And I think that's why the battles over food are not separated from the wider battles that we're going to be talking about throughout Marxism here, about how collectively we can have strength to both shape things in the here and now, but also bring about a complete transformation of the system that actually will put things like food production, the very essence of us, in our hands, that we would control and make decisions about, not those vast multinationals that make decisions just to do with profit.